This essay example, as well as thousands of others, is available in text format on our website for free and without registration. Simply Google Ivy Panda Free Essays.
Introduction. In philosophy, many prominent thinkers have tried to explain how the world is governed and how everything appears. These explanations articulate appropriate principles, and people are familiar with many of them. For example, Thales states that water is the main element, while Anaximenes emphasizes the role of air. However, when it comes to Heraclitus, he believes that fire is the principle of all that exists. Even though his hypothesis seems to be quite controversial at first sight, specific reasons support and explain the given idea. The principle explained. In his works, Heraclitus indicates that fire is an underlying principle of everything because all objects are made of this element. At the same time, the philosopher suggests that the given element makes it possible for various phenomena and objects to change. These two statements are not easy to comprehend at the same time because they offer some controversial ideas. This information creates some exegetically challenges of how it is reasonable to interpret the principle. On the one hand, it is possible to utilize a material approach that will reveal some disadvantages of Heraclitus' hypothesis. On the other hand, the principle under analysis becomes more notional when it is considered as an attempt to create an abstract explanation of how everything works in the universe. These two different approaches will explain why Heraclitus mentions that fire has such significance for the world. Thus, fire occupies an essential role in Heraclitus' philosophy, and his hypothesis evokes a few challenges. Firstly, one should mention that this element was not popular among ancient Greek philosophers since they considered it the most ephemeral of material elements. In spite of that, Heraclitus indicates that fire is what makes stars shine and that it is crucial for the whole world. Secondly, being a continuator of the Milesian school, Heraclitus is a monist, which means that this thinker believes that reality can be reduced to a single element. It is impossible to state why he chose fire, but many suppose that it is because heat is necessary for life. Finally, a significant challenge arises because the philosopher fails to describe how fire can transform into other elements and preserve its original properties. Even though the information above stipulates some exegetically opinions, Heraclitus insists on the significance of fire. Thus, he mentions that this element is the governing principle of reality that will judge and convict everything. While this idea does not contradict the thought of fire being a general principle, it is difficult to comprehend how the two are related to each other. Furthermore, Heraclitus makes a controversial statement that fire does not transform into other elements. When it changes, it disappears. This drastic change results in the fact that this component ceases to exist and is replaced by air. However, the thinker stipulates that fire remains unchanged in some respects after this process. It refers to how this element changes rather than to its material peculiarities. In other words, fire remains constant because it always transforms according to an ordered and balanced way and not because it poses material stability. In addition to that, Heraclitus further develops his idea by mentioning that the existence of fire is commensurate with the objects that it burns. In this case, the philosopher compares fire to gold, stating that all objects are in exchange for fire, just like gold can be exchanged for some goods. Stated differently, one stipulates that these two elements serve as the standard of value that regulates changes. The description is similar to the one mentioned above because fire is the principle not because of its material properties but due to the essential dynamic that it offers. It relates to the fact that this dynamic presents a specific way of how everything can change. Thus, fire is said to be a symbol that describes how all objects and phenomena change and what remains after them. At this point, one can mention that Heraclitus uses two ways to describe fire. Firstly, he defines it as a material element that is necessary for life and is present within stars. Secondly, it is the symbol that explains how all objects can change their properties. These two definitions seem to imply significant differences, which evokes further considerations. On the one hand, it is possible to state that Heraclitus could not overcome those differences and developed separate explanations of his principles. On the other hand, one can suppose that the philosopher created those discrepancies intentionally. It refers to the fact that the idea serves to reveal the limitations of the Milesian school of thought. This supposition of Heraclitus' critical approach sheds light on the issues that have been mentioned previously. Thus, the thinker applies the Milesian philosophical approach to show that it contains some theoretical disadvantages. That is why he chose fire, which is not the most common element for the principle, to design a more conceptual way of explaining how the world works. Conclusion. Heraclitus is famous for creating the hypothesis that fire is the principle of all that exists. This idea is similar to those of the representatives of the Milesian school, who considered a single element the foundation of everything in the world. While water and air manage to meet the requirements of the Milesian philosophy, fire fails to follow them. It is so because this element does not have any material properties that are necessary for transforming into other objects, even though Heraclitus mentions some of them. At the same time, the ancient Greek philosopher argues that fire turns into a completely different element after it ceases to exist. Furthermore, the thinker does not stipulate why he chose fire as the center of this concept, which evokes appropriate challenges in interpreting the principle under analysis. It has been indicated that Heraclitus considers fire as a symbol that denotes a process of how all objects change. Thus, fire is the principle of all that exists because it is stable in a way that it constantly changes objects in an ordered and proportionate manner. This essay on Heraclitus, Fire is the Principle of Everything, was written and submitted by a student just like you. The Ivy Panda Samples database hosts thousands of works similar to this one, on various subjects. Visit ivypanda.com to find what you are looking for, free of charge.